really the thought process behind this one, like we always do, we hope that there's plenty of conversation to go around, but this one in particular, just because of the Super Bowl, we're on the heels of the Super Bowl here, and figured that it would be beneficial for us to dive into how these ideas of key performance inhibitors, pressure, anxiety, fatigue, consequence, sociocultural expectations, all those things, how those influence behavior, and how we as coaches need to, need to make sure that we're implementing them and injecting them into our training sessions, so that we can, make sure that we're doing everything that they can to prepare them for when those situations are experienced in competition. And I think it's no secret to any of us, but these exist in competition across the board, whether we're talking about the Super Bowl or whether we're talking about an 8th grade basketball game. They're really, these things affect athletes regardless of their level of mastery. And so that's why we believe this is a good topic, because it doesn't really matter who you work with. Of course, how you inject these KPIs into training sessions, that then will matter based on who you're working with. But I guess what we wanted to do is just get this started by, or I guess I want to get this started. My initial question and my initial thought was, if you guys have noticed, for the ones that work a lot, or at least the ones, I guess, that get to see their athletes compete, the ones that you get to work with quite a bit, the ones that you get to see compete, how have you noticed key performance inhibitors, pressure, fatigue, anxiety, pressure, all those things? How have you noticed them influencing your athletes' behavior? And what have you noticed to be the biggest differences between training sessions and then all of a sudden when you get to go watch them in competition? That's kind of where I want to start this, I think. And then we can kind of see where this thing goes. And if I have a good example I'd like to start with, if we're going to have a little shy group here at the beginning.
Well, and I can certainly jump in, or I would be willing to jump in if you want to get to that point. But if you want to share your story to see maybe if the shyness, breaks the shyness a little bit as well and opens up some lines of communication, by all means do so, Rich.
I will. And it's actually something that that Tyler and I have had plenty of conversations about. And really, so for those that don't know, we work in a facility, a private facility that houses both male and female athletes, all the way from age 8 to 18, and obviously some older in the college, the college realm as well. And it's funny to see the interactions based on age, but when there are males and females training in the same facility, and sometimes even those males and females will have relationships with each other. So you'll have boyfriend and girlfriend in the same facility, not necessarily working out together, but just there together. And we have seen on a number of occasions, and I know this is something that Shawn has talked about a number of times, where he has had individuals, significant others, family members, things like that, come out to training sessions to see how that influences behavior. Well, this is something that Tyler and I honestly get to naturally see almost on a given night, because, I mean, for those that work with male and female athletes, that they get a little shy around each other, depending on the age. It goes back and forth, but the change in behavior, even when males are in the same facility as females when they're working out, or the change in behavior when some guy's girlfriend is in the cage right next to the facility, right next to the the turf space that we're using, and how sometimes for sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Maybe all of a sudden he starts trying harder. Maybe all of a sudden his volume, his voice gets louder. He wants to interact more. He's trying to let's be honest, impress her. And it's just been very, very interesting to kind of sit back and see how, even through the same activities that we plan, sometimes the facility's empty. It's just the college guys, like over the summertime in particular, it'd be just the college guys, music blaring. There's only guys in the facility. Things are a little bit different. Now, all of a sudden, on a different day, when there's some softball players in there, things change immensely, and really nothing about the session has changed, but all of a sudden the people that are in the building have changed things. And so we've been lucky because we haven't really had to worry about injecting much of that into training, because it just naturally takes place in our facility. But I, previous to to working down at starters, I never really thought about the importance of making sure that those types of things are present. I certainly tried to do it through maybe competition, as far as like keeping score in certain activities or things like that, but never to the degree that I've seen it kind of unfold here at starters. And so I mean, now I try to put it in almost every single session. Now, to what degree and to what scale, obviously that depends on who I'm working with and what we're trying to accomplish. But I've realized that because it does affect behavior so much, that it's something that I think we need to be very, very conscious about. And the one thing I want to mention, and then I'll kind of pass the mic off here, is kind of switch gears just a little bit. But this idea, I know that the coaches like to use physical punishment as consequence, where, if you get this wrong, you have to do X amount of push-ups. If you get this wrong, we got to get on the line and we're going to run gassers or whatever. And I one thing that Tyler and I talk about frequently, and that he kind of brought to light after some conversations we had on this topic, was that consequence doesn't always necessarily have to be physical. In fact, I got a very good example from one of our coaches at the facility just the other night. He was working with a younger group of guys, probably 10, 11, 12, something like that. And he was trying to find different ways to inject consequence, that didn't involve physical punishment into the particular activity that he was having his kids work on. And so earlier in the session, one of his kids was bragging about how he was a ladies' man and he's got a girlfriend and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, mind you, these are 10-year-olds, right? So he was just kind of running his mouth a little bit, and Tyler put that in his back pocket, and it just kind of came to him as he was trying to figure out ways to inject consequence. He said, okay, losers of this next activity have to go over, and he pointed to a cage right across the one he was working, and he said, you have to go introduce yourself to that girl. Now, this was an 18-year-old softball player. And Tyler, obviously knowing that this was going to probably catch these guys by surprise, they said, well, are you serious? And he said, no, I'm dead serious. The losers of this next activity have to walk over, and you have to introduce yourself to that girl and have a conversation with her. Faces jumped, he said eyes got real big, and all of a sudden everyone was a little quiet. And he's like, is he serious? Yeah, he's pretty serious. And he said, lo and behold, all of a sudden the amount of effort, the amount of intent I got out of that next activity, man, you wouldn't believe it, because obviously nobody wanted to lose because they were 10 and they didn't want to introduce themselves to 18-year-olds. So I just thought that was a little fitting that happened just the night ago on the heels of this conversation. But those are my ads. Those are my thoughts. So I guess I'll open up the floor to anybody else who wants to jump in here.
Well, and I love the example, Rich. We're talking about this, or we started brainstorming around it simply with the Super Bowl, coming up here on the horizon. But like you said, it does apply at all levels of sport. One thing that I would ask, regardless of the levels, or maybe irregardless of the levels as well, is maybe for the group, what effects do we see these key performance inhibitors, such specifically pressure and anxiety and social cultural constraints, expectations of the world, if you will? What effects do we see those key performance inhibitors have on movement skill and movement behavior? Like, how do we know that pressure and anxiety are obviously rearing their ugly head? We have like sort of the Dustin Johnson US Open golf tournament. We have these examples of really true major choking. But excluding those extreme examples, how do we know it's happening? What effects do we see on the movement system? And how do we know if our athletes are suffering from it? Anyone?
I see that really often. It's how do I put it? The most obvious sign is when they don't look like they are an active participant in what's going on around them. Let me be more specific. The other night, this poor kid swung and missed at front toss. Like, it should be easy, right? Swung and missed about 11 times in a row. And we stopped and we said, okay, what the hell, man? And it almost seemed like he woke up in that moment and he wasn't awake before, because he's in his head. The pressure that he's putting, in that case, he's putting on himself. It's a practice environment, right? There's no actual pressure, but he is 14. So he literally goes through all day, every day of self-conscious puberty brain, like do I smell weird? Am I standing funny? Like, you know, it's the only thing they can think about. And you can see it because they don't move in a way that looks like they are actively seeing what's going on around them at all, right? They're just trying to do what coach said, and they're so busy thinking about what's going on with their body, they're not aware of their surroundings whatsoever. They're not really aware of what's going on. And to me, to my eye, it's always really obvious. Like it looks like a sleepwalker because they're just thinking about their weird body, you know, because they don't know what to do with it. So on a regular basis, I see that sort of like trance-like zone out all the time.
It almost sounds like it's a freezing of degrees of freedom, whether we're talking perceptually, cognitively, physically, whatever it is. I guess that's how I noticed it, Shawn, to answer your question. I think that's kind of what exactly Zach just explained, is just the freezing of degrees of freedom, and you see them literally freeze.
So almost like that disorder takes over the system, if you will, and allows that zombie-like state that Zach kind of described, where the degrees of freedom are maybe not being organized or coordinated, you know, to optimally fit the problems that they're facing, whether it's in the actual practice environment or whether it's in the game. Brenden?
Oh, well, I don't work with a lot of teenagers. I work with one, and he's and again, I don't get to apply a lot of these concepts. It's a strongman competitor, but I try. And what I notice is the performance shifts. The confidence tends to waver. The patterns of the movement seem different, less sure, and certainly less exploratory. And that's typically when, and then like he said, I can't remember his name here. Rich hit it on the head. Is, yeah, freezing degrees of freedom is what I've noticed. And I haven't come up with a really solid, effective way of yanking them back into reality, other than directly confronting it, saying, okay, what's going on? Where are you at? You're not here when you're doing it.
That less exploratory part is something that I think we could definitely tease out and discuss, because obviously if they aren't exploring, they probably aren't overly sensitive or attuned to the environment and the information in the respective problem to actually even interact with that problem disposition in a really functionally fit fashion, right? You know, if you think about what Zach was talking about there, like it's just a practice activity or a practice drill, and the individual isn't even able to explore. Obviously, that's the time to explore. And if you can't do it on something as simple as, you know, a reductionist, isolatory type of action, when are we going to do it?
Well, exactly. And that what I would say is that even in a practice environment, and I go through this too, even when I'm sparring boxing, there's always pressure, but it's a skill to be able to saddle it and kind of ride it out instead of letting it kick you off and throw you off your game. There's always pressure, but you know, and that again, that's it's a learned skill like anything else. It's almost, there's almost a craft to it, you know, because the fear is absolutely necessary.
Well, and especially
pressure
in the
is
tasks that
absolutely
you
necessary.
work with, right? The individuals that you work with and the tasks that they face.
Because if you're not, yeah, exactly. If you're not afraid, then you're not paying attention. That's just what I've noticed.
Well, and we typically, for those out there, Brenden and I typically have conversations about Israel Adesanya, and I know that one of his favorite quotes that he uses is that pressure is an acquired taste. And I'm sure other people have used that as well, but it's something that he frequently says, like, you know, you have to not necessarily neglect the pressure, because the pressure is going to be operating as this overriding umbrella, especially if you're in a combat sport and it's one-on-one and there's an octagon locked behind you, or you can't get out of that ring, right? And so it is an acquired taste. If it is an acquired taste, then how do we go about determining, you know, making it maybe more tasteful, or allowing that performer to be able to eat it and chew on it a little bit more? How do we get to that point?
That's the study. right? Because that's the difference between an excellent performer and someone who chokes, typically, or the ability to take that punch and accept the failure and adapt to it and then change your tack.
Yeah.
How do you get there?
Yeah, and I guess that's the golden question, right? That's $1 million question. If we can come to that answer, I think we can all log off, because we're going to be a little richer than we were at the start of it, right?
Right. Well, how does it get representative enough? How do you, where does that little slice of the game lie in the practice environment? That's what I've been trying to play with, and that's what I've been trying to replicate for years. And I feel like I'm right on the verge of something, and then it slips away. It's get close, but never close enough.
Yeah, and of course it is difficult in the sports that you have participants from. Adam, I noticed something that you typed in on the side there. Would you mind expanding upon that a little bit more? Like, you talk about that shift becoming more internal as opposed to external, and maybe someone constraining their actions a little bit more. What else? How are you noticing that, to where you can explicitly notice that this is occurring, Adam?
Okay, I can just use an example from my sport. And I've actually gone through this twice, and actually both players kind of did the same thing. And it was both like, what immediately jumped to my head was milestones, because I had two players who, approached 1,000-point games. And up until that point, like the preceding games, you could tell they'd be pressing early on, pressing in, quotation marks here, but really it was just an area of focus. Like, they were more or less indifferent in the warm-ups to the teammates. That what I really noticed most of all was their behavior was atypical. They weren't acting like their typical selves in that environment. And, they were just constantly just focused on, all right, so what should I be doing? And like, they felt like the entire spotlight was on them the entire time when it wasn't. And really the only way I could really get them out, and I managed to get them out of it both ways. It was basically, one, I was a coach on the staff, and I just said, hey, meet me an hour before the game instead of our normal like pregame warm up, get there 45 minutes early. So we just played one-on-one for 15 minutes. And I basically just tried to knock him out of it. And we played a one-on-one. I was talking smack to him. I was just trying to get him to be himself again. And that's what we basically talked about right before he went into the warm-ups. I go, this is the person you need to be. You don't need to be anybody else. You just need to be you. That's what got you here. Don't worry. 1,000 points will come if you be you. And then I did a similar thing with another athlete that came up, this past season, and we just went in the gym like the day before, and we went through a lot of activities, and we went live a lot, where I would just give him stuff he'd encountered during the game, and I was playing defense. And again, I was just lighthearted, talking smack. We were joking around with each other, and again, just incorporate this more than anything else, just to get that attention off yourself. But that's the biggest thing I see, is just the narrowing of attention, which, if you narrow your attention, you're going to be less tuned into the environment, and it's going to be harder to perform, especially in a team sport.
What I like about that, Adam, and obviously I don't think there's a gold standard test for this by any means to where it can be even somewhat replicated in every environment. But what I take from that is by going out there and having this kind of 1v1 type situation where there's still some competitiveness to it, and you're providing the anxiety and the pressure by, challenging him in certain ways, you're almost helping him free both cognitive and motor system degrees of freedom. Perceptually, he may have been constrained already, which is what you're discussing, but by you allowing him or even nudging him to be him and seeing him starting to be more fluid with his movement, maybe he's making a few more baskets, or maybe he's crossing you over a few more times than he normally would be. I see that as being something that starts to free those system degrees of freedom, which allows more fluidity, which is oftentimes going to promote greater search and more focus of attention, or directed attention, or education of attention in areas that are specific to that sport, or going to be very informative to him or for him. And you didn't necessarily need to tell him, do this, do that, but by you creating a situation where he could kind of free or relax a little bit, it allowed for him to do just what you said, be him. So I think there's a lot that can be taken from that, because you're helping to not only educate his attention, but maybe even unknowingly you're educating his intention by allowing him to shift his focus a bit. And I think that there's a lot that can be taken from that. So nice job on that. I'm sure it sounded like it worked, but I think that we being whoever the coach athlete relationship is, we have the best understanding if we work with them often of who they are and the nuances of them. And so there's not a one size fits all by any means, but having a tuned in relationship as a coach is something that can be helpful, even if we're not necessarily telling them or asking them to behave in certain ways. The environment that we're creating or the situation that we're undertaking is helping educate them or inform them along the way.
Well, and the thing is, I think as well, you know, it's sometimes difficult, especially even to get feedback from athletes, right? Like, I think I go back to this past Saturday, and those of you who are on this call probably know that I'm fairly interested in mixed martial arts. And obviously Dustin Poirier upset Conor McGregor on Saturday night. But when I found it really interesting when they talked to Poirier afterwards, he said, I don't enjoy this. I don't like this. I felt like I was completely off. I felt like I didn't even want to be here when I was in the locker room until I got in the octagon and the door actually closed and I saw my opponent standing across from me. Like, I didn't even want to be here. Right. So I think when we talk about how pressure and anxiety could potentially impact the system, the individual themselves may not be able to articulate as to what they're adequately feeling, because then he goes and has, you know, arguably the greatest performance in his career in a 32 fight career or something. I think it's really, it becomes this really big gray area for us. And we really have to try to intimately know the athlete and who they are and what their system does, how they may typically coordinate, you know, because I heard a lot of things in regards to everyone's answer about, you know, the atypical nature of someone's movement problem solving process at some level or another. And sometimes we wouldn't even be able to get the athlete to understand that they might be suffering from the effects of pressure and anxiety or other constraints like that.
Yeah, that's a valuable add. The one thing I would add to that, and I picked up on, I came on the call, obviously, Brenden, I think as you guys were discussing your athletes and the ones you work with, and yes, there's very different in nature than American football players and baseball players and a lot of the field sports that we work with, or me specifically. But I would say you were asking, like, how do I go about helping them? How can I help them in those situations? And I think it's kind of finding or striking that balance of, you know, finding some successes within the ring or within, you know, the sport or the combat situation that you're working in, whilst still allowing for learning to be messy and having some failures. And what I mean by that is, you know, whether it's hand-on-hand combat, whatever it may be, to where if you are trying to help them along the way and they are constantly being in a situation where you would have been able to take their weapon away, or they would have been in a very challenging situation, that isn't going to likely inspire them to want to continue. And every athlete's different, or every individual we work with is different. So it might for some, but I think finding some successes is a positive thing within every session, and not creating a situation where you're making it very easy for them. But what I'm essentially saying in a more complex way is dialing the complexity down a bit. Maybe it is moving speeds that are moving slower. So maybe you're moving slower. You hear Shawn talk about ownership speed. It's something that I've been utilizing for the past couple of years that has worked really well within field sports, is allowing that athlete to move at their ownership speed. And so in turn, you may slow your speeds down a bit, which allows them to start to connect and pick up with orientation of the body. And maybe that reduces the anxiety and the pressure that is present in the situation, because now it's a problem that they are able to find a functional fit for, in the form of being able to de-arm you or feel confident with their ability to stand there with you. And hopefully that makes some sense. But reducing the complexity by changing the movement speeds of just yourself in general to help reduce complexity that is present within the situation.
You know, there's something that popped into my head as we were sort of talking about what kind of effects do we notice when we analyze the movement behavior of athletes and we think or speculate that they may be becoming a victim to these key performance inhibitors, or those that pressure and anxiety and the constraints of them are really constraining the movement system. Do we and can we actually believe or notice that it's sort of like a regression of one's movement skill, or is it just fixing and freezing of one's degrees of freedom? Maybe that question doesn't completely make sense, but maybe it does if anybody has any ideas there. Like, do we think that it's just a regression, like it's something, they are maybe a skeleton of who they typically would be or who they used to be? Or do we think it's just this necessary inherent byproduct of the human movement system not being as robust as it needs to be to face the pressures and anxieties?
I wanted to add something that I think is related. What kind of occurred to me is that pressure, anxiety probably changes our relationship to the environment and what information we're able to pick up. So it either, to what I think Brenden said in the chat, like it may open you up to actually, it may get you focused and allow you to see opportunities or connect with information that you otherwise won't be able to connect with, or it will do the inverse and it actually limits your ability to pick up information, your ability to search and to connect with the environment. So I thought that was something that just kind of popped in my head while I was thinking about anxiety and pressure within the sporting context.
So you feel as though, Garrett, that they are then obviously not finding themselves being able to be as sensitive to the same specifying information, that they aren't able to control their degrees of freedom perceptually to be able to connect to the most adequate specifying information? It's kind of
Yeah,
weird.
I think it changes the relationship between the athlete and the environment, essentially.
P.S. That beard really came in strong in the last week since I've seen you on Zoom. So, other thoughts there? I know that we've talked a lot about, what it looks like, and we've talked a little bit about how we get to that place. What signifies someone who, we believe actually does handle the constraints of pressure and anxiety and social culture constraints better than those individuals who are fixed and frozen? Is it just the completely still sensitive, still adaptable, still dexterous mover? How do we know that the individual, or is it just somebody who hasn't regressed as much as their counterparts? Because I think it's really easy to say, well, that person still succeeded, like Tom Brady, he still led his team back from, 28-3. Obviously, he can withstand pressure and anxiety, but what kind of signifies that individual who is maybe more robust and bulletproof to those constraints?
I've noticed with at least in my own sport, it's common to see the guys that respond really well. They are able to push the game towards their strengths, if that makes sense, rather than avoiding their weaknesses. So for example, a pitcher starting in a big game, he might have strengths and weaknesses like every pitcher does. He has good pitches that he trusts more than he does other pitches. A pitcher who doesn't respond well to pressure won't steer at bats towards his strengths. He'll try too hard to either avoid his weaknesses, or he'll try to pitch to the hitter's weaknesses, and he may not be able to execute those because like Garrett said, his relationship between the information that's in front of him has been skewed in some way. He's not interpreting the information in the same way that he would if the pressure was lower and he was feeling more confident. So then in turn, he doesn't use the strengths that he actually has as well. So if a guy handles that better, he's going to continue to pitch to his strengths more than he's going to try to pitch to the hitter's weaknesses, rather than trying to just avoid his weaknesses. Walk guys because he's afraid to throw a pitch because he doesn't think he can throw it for a strike. Give up extra base hits because he is afraid that he's not going to locate pitches that he knows he normally would, but he doesn't interpret the information that's in front of him the same way in maybe a game that has less pressure. You see the same with hitters. They'll swing at pitches they wouldn't normally swing at if the pressure's on. They know what pitches they hit well and what they don't. But when the pressure's on, they seem to forget. They don't interpret the information the same way that they would. It's not necessarily that their ability, their movement abilities change. Their swing doesn't like break down and look way different or bad. They just don't understand what's going on in front of them in the same manner. So the guys that stick to what they know they're good at are the ones that, to me, it looks like they're really thriving under pressure. they don't leave their wheelhouse, right? Both literally and figuratively.
So Zach, I don't necessarily disagree by any means. I think you make some very valid points there, but I would almost even just to put it out there, could it be the opposite that also signifies someone that is very comfortable with the anxiety and the pressure in that moment? And to give you an example, you were going down the baseball and the pitching route, and I can give it a quarterback route or another sport. But let's say I'm comfortable. I feel like I'm riding that anxiety well, or riding that pressure in that moment well. And I start to explore throwing pitches that might not be my number one or my number two, because I'm handling the situation well, and I start looking at ways in which I can solve that problem differently, even if it's on the same hitter that I faced. So I'm starting to try to work a slider in, but I don't normally throw one on a regular basis. Or if I'm a quarterback and maybe my wheelhouse is throwing short and mid-level routes, but I start, having plays that are called that I'm either, nudging the offensive coordinator to call, or I'm changing at the line to where I'm looking for some deeper routes down the field because I'm feeling confident in my abilities. Maybe I've been successful in the fact that I've made a number of completions in a row. And that maybe is a true sign, whether it be in practice or whether it be in a game, of someone that is handling that anxiety and pressure and is performing in a dexterous way, is starting to challenge themselves differently, because now they're trying to expand their bandwidth of their movement solution capability because they're now confident in what they do. Just to kind of give you a different perspective, that's kind of one way in which I personally do it in a practice setting with some of my athletes. In addition to a number of other things I'm welcome to share, but I try to get them to a place to where, or see how they move, and then they're getting to a place where they can become comfortable across conditions rather than it being in a short range.
I think that I agree with that completely, and I don't mean to just jump in here. And what I was going to say is, I'm not a team sports guy, and I would ask, is anybody really bulletproof or immune to these pressures? I think that they're absolutely necessary to bring out some of the best performances. Like, look at Poirier. Like Shawn said, he didn't even want to be there, and I think the hallmark of a really great event is almost invariably someone overcoming those internal strifes. And you go in with the plan, but what happens when the plan goes to shit? You fight the battle. And if you're able to adapt and not rely on necessarily your strengths or your wheelhouse, but on your dexterity, on your emotional and physical dexterity, and still overcome the event and come out on top, or even just come out with a few decent rounds. I think those are all qualities of dexterity. I think that, and that's ultimately the goal, is how do we capitalize on that? How do we start to develop that adaptability and that dexterity? So you're not going in there relying on that, on your powerful 1, 2, 3, but you can go in there and you can pick it apart and you can fight the game that you're given and still make it work. Does that make sense, or am I rambling?
No, it makes sense. It makes sense for sure. Let me ask you this before anybody provides an answer. Do you have any ways in which you have recently being, let's say, in the past 6 months to a year, do you have ways that you started to explore giving them an opportunity to become more comfortable in their situation or across conditions?
Always pressure.
I'm sorry, always pressure.
It's always pressure. And it's different. And I'm sorry to interrupt. You want to finish here?
No,
so I'm typically working one-on-one, or what I've been trying to do recently is I'll have another fighter in there acting in place of the referee to work around.
Okay.
So there's 3 of us, and we've got the eyes of the mover, we've got the eyes of the game setter, which would be me, and then the eyes of another athlete who's acting as the referee. And I try to take them, I make them hit the things that they suck at, the things that they don't want to be doing, the weakest aspects, because that's typically what they're going to encounter. If anybody worth their salt in the game is going to spend hours watching your tapes, and they're going to find exactly where your holes are. So I want them to spend as much time cinching up those holes as possible. And there's a bunch of different methods to get there, but none of them are linear. There are these little micro regressions, and there's good days and there's bad days. But if somebody's bad in the pocket, I'll hunker them up and I'll pressure on them in the corner on the ropes, and I'll just hammer them until they can figure out how to get out, or start chasing them, or start cutting off ground. I think it has to be, it can't be too much or they get angry and then they're not learning.
Just to jump in real quick, in that example where you got them on the ropes, do you ever change, this goes back to the point I was making earlier, do you ever change the speed at which
yes
solution is moving? I ask because if you were on the ropes with me and you were pounding me, I would likely need you to slow down, that way I can pick up orientation and start to.
Well, that's exactly right. It has to start like what you would call ownership speed. It has to start where they can. It's different on the ropes because you can't necessarily see what's going on, but it can be slow enough to, they have to be able to learn to move correctly and understand where and where not to go, and where the lanes are, where the lanes are not. So yes, and I don't ever bring it up above 60-70%. It's just there's no reason to outside of the actual event.
Yeah, I might need you at 20 or 30 in order to not be killed.
Well, that's always where we start.
No, you make a good point though. I mean, and when you say they need to move correctly, I would imagine that you're allowing for them to find their movement solution through having that ownership and yeah.
Because there's no right answer. There's A, B, and C, and then there's stuff that they come up with that I couldn't have ever fucking imagined. That's beautiful. Mm-hmm. That I wouldn't have ever even conceived of. And that's when the cool stuff starts to happen, is when they start owning these things and it starts breaking apart from the conventional approach, and you start seeing these really wacky lines, but they're making it work. I think that's the coolest stuff. And that's ultimately where I want to get.
Yeah.
Movement is movement.
I know I just want to mention one more thing, and I'll myself for a bit, but when you guys were talking earlier about seeing the emergence of someone that handles pressure and anxiety well, and you were talking about fighting, to stay in that same area, and pardon me if I'm butchering the name or the individual, but Holloway, whenever he's talking to the commissary, like to me, and that's an extreme example, but someone that is flexible and adaptable enough in their environment to where they can actually focus their attention and pick up information in the form of responding to someone in another area, but still be fluid enough, even if they're catching glimpses of what they need to behave in a way that is effective, that is functional. And that would be an example to me. I don't think that there's necessarily a time and a place where you're going to have that happen on a regular basis, but that was a display of it to me. And the only other thing I would mention would be one way that I like to help provide an opportunity for my athletes to experience handling or controlling their own, level of just ability, in a situation or need in a situation to act in certain ways, is to have them perform in a variety of different conditions. So we're talking about a lot of different things here, but one thing we're not really mentioning is performing on different surfaces. We're not talking about starting at different times of the day. We've exhausted having people come to a practice. We've talked about that for probably a year and a half, which is certainly beneficial. But I think just changing the setting, the amount of light that is structured in the area is also.
Yeah, it's very important, and that brings out the adaptability, is I think. And I don't mean to interrupt, but yeah, I change their footwear. I'll change where to get. Sometimes we'll go out, we'll set up a rumble ring, and it'll be in gravel.
It's doing the things then, Brenden. You asked, like, what could I do? I mean, in my opinion, without being in your situation, from what you're sharing, it sounds as though by changing the environmental conditions and manipulating tasks.
It's all just old JKD stuff. Like, Shawn would be into this. He's probably aware of it, but this isn't really anything new. But what surprises me is that it's not really widely utilized anymore, which is, it's strange because it worked 100 years ago. This is what Jack Johnson did. This is what, people get stuck on the veneer. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is.
So if I could direct the conversation, and sorry to put you on the spot, Jared, if you're not going to right now, I completely understand. But you have vast amount of experience in the Olympic Games at the highest level. What were some of the ways when you guys, whether it was travel times, locations, practice conditions, and whatnot, when you're preparing elite level athletes for a rugby match, what were some of the things that were done to help give them or allow for them to gain experience under those conditions and across those conditions in order to be able to handle the pressure and anxiety of playing on a stage when you have millions and millions and millions of people watching from across the globe?
Yeah, I think back to even just doing the same warm up every day. That actually inhibited them, because one day I changed the warm up and then they went to practice and it was a contact and they didn't feel ready for practice. Like, Jared, I can't be ready. We didn't do enough. I don't feel good, because we did the same warm up every time. And I'm like, oh, I just fucked them up. Mentally, they were just not there because they were used to that same warm up and that same habit. So I think we need to be careful how we if we keep doing the same thing over, that we don't scale things properly or plan for different adaptations, plan for problems. So when they do go to that competition, that they're ready for that chaos. Or I remember one time we were in Dubai, and we didn't have the hit shields or whatever, the pads or whatever, so they tackle each other. They were just going in there so tentative. They don't want to get hurt for the game, so they're just hit, kind of to wrap up, drive their feet, a couple steps, done. I'm like, what are we doing out here? I kind of gave them a little tune-up. I'm like, let's go. Fucking, you got to go full go in like 15 minutes. We're going to go back to the locker room. Let's actually get some hits in. And they're like, oh, yeah, I kind of shook them out of it, and they woke back up. But they couldn't do that unless I said that, you know? So it's the preparation. We have to give them autonomy and let those captains lead, make them aware of those situations when they're not aware. I mean, that's what a good coach should do. And then, yeah, those are just little examples.
What do you feel as though the difference was in that Dubai situation that made it to where they were kind of out of their element, maybe all of them, or it sounds like a vast majority of them? What do you feel as though maybe could have been done prior? I mean, obviously you helped them in the moment, but was there a particular thing that you guys were able to point out, or did you communicate with them on what was challenging them that was maybe freezing their ability to move as well?
Yeah, it was just, they were expecting something to be there that was always there, and then it wasn't there. You know what I mean? And then it's kind of like, oh, the surprise. They're kind of like when you can't find your keys and you got to go get in the car and you're late for a meeting, you kind of freeze and you don't know what to do. It's that same kind of feeling, and just making them aware of it and then talking them through or giving them comfort, like a voice of almost like calmness, or somebody they could trust. I've always been there, said this, this, and this. So they could say, okay, yeah, we can get back to it. We're going to be okay. It's not a big deal. And then go back to your point, like earlier, with some of the track and field athletes, that some, I believe, just have this innate ability that they don't even think about those things that other athletes think about. Like when they're out there by themselves and they're going to do a long jump. There's this guy who won gold in Rio. And when you talk to him, he's just like so calm, doesn't really have much going through his head. I just go out there, do what coach says, shows up in the weight room, doesn't do much. Like a month before the games, before Rio, the other S&C coach was working with him at the time, and all they did was step ups of like an 8-inch box with like 150 kilos going to the games. He didn't even lift, and he had lifted always before every other competition. And now with this COVID stuff going on, I'm like, this is perfect for this guy. I know he's going to be ready to go for the Olympics. He doesn't need much. He just goes out there and he executes. It's interesting where different athletes are at, and like we have to coach them all differently and be aware of what triggers they have. Some are very, like, a lot of energy's got to go into them. They got to always be kind of looked after. And other athletes, you can just throw them in there, they're gonna be fine, and their talent will take over, kind of thing. Yeah.
One more question for you, just because I'm actually really curious. I appreciate the expansion on that. Going back to the device situation, and obviously them not having the warm up that they were expecting, or some of the activities that they were going to be going through that they'd done on a regular basis that got them out of their element. What was the environmental conditions like that day in Dubai?
Yeah, it was a typical day in Dubai. It was winter, so we were there in December. Sunny, about 90 degrees, just like every other practice we'd had that week. Fans, there was a lot of fans. Dubai's always packed, probably 20,000 out in the middle of the desert, you know. So they were kind of like, but they were used to the crowd, so it wasn't. I don't think it was the crowd thing. It was just mostly just something changed. Like I feel like when we go to the warm-ups and stuff, like the warm-up was on the pitch actually that we we're competing in, just in the back of the end zone. We had like 20 meters. Sometimes the warm up is like off somewhere else too. So maybe that kind of threw them off too. There was kind of a different place, but yeah, it was just like that equipment thing, something so simple that just totally put the.
Well, I think it's brilliant that you were aware enough to just say, hey guys, you have permission. Do what you do. Do what you do. Don't worry about the other stuff. That's huge. That probably changed the entire outcome.
I think so.
It
kind of brought like a relief to them. You could just see on their face. They're like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we're fine. Then it would just go back to something of comfort to them, an activity. And then like we're gonna go out there and smash in about 15 minutes. Don't worry about it. Like, but they were getting all caught up in it. Anxious. It's like, shut up. You're listening to the negative thoughts. You gotta listen to the good thoughts now. Let's go. So it's amazing at that level too, because how many warm-ups have they done and how many games have they competed in? But it was something like that just that threw them off. And then that's where I went back to reflect after that tournament too. Like, we got to get some more adversity into these warm-ups and practice, and that's
getting
my bad.
on that comfort level, because that's what it is. It's you get comfortable with, and would that be considered habituation at that point?
Yeah, it was a habit. Yeah, they were just like programmed, brain was turned off, going through the motions, like, and then I started bringing warm-ups that were always different, always dedicated to whatever the scout report had for on the last half of the warm-up. So it'd always be based off the team that we were going to face, and we talk about in the locker room before we go out there. We're going to spread stuff out a little more, give you a little more run on. They like to move the ball wide, so we're going to have to bunch in, hit on a little faster, make sure we're getting our communication from our sweeper better. All these things we talk about before in the locker room, so we go out there. Or the coach would even give me, like, during practice, leading before we even left for the tournament, we would talk about this kind of stuff. So it was going on constantly. And
so you're literally controlling almost every facet of the engagement for them. You're setting up a representative little space to play. That's really cool. It's just so their adaptability is really contingent on your awareness and your adaptability to what's going on with the other teams and what's going on with that. That's just a lot going on there. That's very impressive.
Yeah, well, hopefully not. It's not based on me. Hopefully it's based on them eventually, that they can take over, and adapt to those things. So hopefully I'm just moving those people in, and then they're picking it up immediately within the game plan, because that's what teams will do, right? They'll have one game plan going in, and then they'll switch it instead of moving the ball wide.
That's the emergent behavior, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. And that same thing with fighting, I'm sure.
Another thing you mentioned there, which is really interesting, I think, that I would like to pull out, is the giving them an opportunity to gain experience in the principles of play of another team. So if a team is, if their defense actually does space out more so, which is not really as common or a typical principle of play in invasion sports, clustering together more so to limit the gaps that are available to pass the body or the ball through. And this team does. If you guys are allowing for them to have that experience in a very self-ownership type way where they can organize and self-organize effectively, I think is something that certainly prepares them for teams that they will play versus just the rote repetition, get the ball from the ruck to the ring winger. I know I'm probably way off of my positions here, so forgive me.
No,
but you get my point, and so just for you guys giving them an opportunity to take principles of play within the game itself, and then through film and analyzing the film as coaches and athletes, picking up on ways in which the other team might play and being able to give them representative looks of how that team does behave is certainly beneficial, because that's picking up on the emergent tendencies of other teams. And you're not trying to replicate exactly how they move by any means, but giving them opportunity to gain experience against that and knowledge of.
Jared, I have a question, if based on something that you said right at the onset of your answer, if you would elaborate upon. You mentioned obviously not doing an habitual way of warming up or of moving or preparing to move, right? It's one thing that I've switched probably a handful of years ago, 5 years ago or so, with my NFL guys as well. And how did the team setting or individuals within the team setting handle that? Because obviously I know that even on an individual by individual basis, it's sometimes like you know, you got to shake them kind of out of that
Yeah.
way of warming up. Otherwise, they almost get in this mindset like, I need this, like almost this,
Yeah.
you know, prototypical way of doing things, just thinking like, if I don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm not going to be prepared. How did you feel as though guys got over that, especially when we're talking about, you know, obviously in the rugby situation, you play more matches or play more games, but specifically like Olympic athletes who, you know, might be preparing for this singular event that's going to define who they are and what their athletic career is really about.
I mean, that's a really really where you got to rely on trust and respect. I think like that you have that camaraderie between each other, and then I framed it in the way of we're still going to target those same things. We're still going to get your range of motion. We're still going to get your heart rate up, all the good things that a warm up can do. But now we're just going to switch it up onto you. So you might not know what's going to happen next, or I might not know what's going to happen next in this activity. But that's okay. Let's find comfort in that and just accept that. And then all of a sudden they saw some success. You put them in little moments, how you scale that. You scale it just minute by minute or little by little. When they are fresher, maybe they can have success. And then once they have the success, that first taste of it, they're like, oh, I can do anything now. It's all going to be okay. It's good. It was just a belief in my head. I had to get rid of that belief. Now I can move on.
And did you notice a direct carryover or transfer then to the way that they would perform when they had to be adaptable once the game or match or event began?
Yeah. So even just that little thing can go through multiple things, multiple facets in how we prepared and how we set up different situations and how I gave limited information maybe sometimes and how we're gonna play end ball today, but actually as soon as the one person tags somebody, they're gonna run off and they're gonna have to go do 20 push-ups over there. So there's gonna be a giant gap right in the middle. If you guys want to take advantage of that, I sure would, you know, and run through that hole. And maybe that's gonna happen, maybe it's not. And then I would just move people out of there. Like say they would get one person tagged, I'd be like 2 people tagged, 3 people tagged, just change it up right in the game. So they don't even get to talk about it. They don't really understand what's going on. They don't know how it's going to unfold really. So but there was no confusion. There was no that frozen moment anymore. It was like, okay, let's just move it. Let's pull it back out, look at the big picture again, and then try to attack again and run through people different holes. If they run out faster, instead of just moving wide all the time, now they can start to see holes because they gave themselves time to adapt and see what's going to unfold, whatever emerges in front of them. But I don't think they would have had that same mindset. They would have freaked out. Then we'd had to bring them in, talk a little bit more. I'd have to explain it to them. But now I didn't have to explain anything. They were out there solving the problem immediately by themselves. Yeah. And it was just something that I don't know if it carried from the warm-ups, but it was just like a mindset that actually started to carry through the team. And a philosophy that started to occur, you know, and they believed in each other a little more, that they could solve these on their own. They don't have to look at me all the time.
Well, and I think if we talk about becoming sensitive to obviously what our opponent or what the situations are going to bring, regardless of what sport we're talking about, it seems almost ridiculous. It seems really, you know, to the point where we're violating who we are as practitioners if we don't allow them to solve problems and interact with that information of those behaviors of their opponent, right? Like if they don't do any of that within movement preparation times, you know, I almost feel negligent when I think back to what I did 10, 12 years ago with players where I had them do something in a rote repetition way or fashion, even though that's not how they acquired the skill or became more adaptable to begin with. I feel somewhat negligent in my role for almost advocating for that, you know, not allowing them to be problem solvers really right from the start at the most opportune time, right before they go to the most important moment of the week.
Yeah, you really set the tone from immediately when you do that. Either way, like you can get them to put them in a mode where they just kind of turn off, or a mode they can turn on and communicate and create a good energy. And then I feel like I felt kind of guilty because I was stealing maybe their victory, you know, by giving them the answer sometimes. And I was like, that's not going to last as long in the end of it. And they're not going to carry over and transfer. Yeah.
That's a really good point. You know, it's funny you were mentioning, Jared, and obviously you and I were the ones that were going about doing this, but we were talking earlier about just even doing something simple. And for those of you that are listening now and that are going to be listening later on, if you're starting to try to create situations where athletes can experience changes which may drive up anxiety and create pressure, we started doing this in 2016. It was the end of 2016 for something that is very, very decontextualized for the sport, such as the NFL Combine. We were doing it with a quarterback that was going to be at the Combine at that time, changing up not only his warm-up, but but also what station. And for those of you that are familiar with the circus show that is the combine, what station he was going to be going to, we'd have this one set that they would change it on him. And the reasons why they do it oftentimes like that, especially at some of the regional ones before they get to Indianapolis. So when you were talking about that, just to see the stress level that was created, and they're going to perform what I would consider to be a relatively simplistic movement or simplistic activity, and just the pressure that creates. So then it started to get my wheels turning, because I started to think about what happens if this is even more complex and it's an actual sport. So those were easy ways for me personally to start to dabble in changing things where I had to relinquish control to a certain extent. And so I would encourage those of you out there that are not familiar with allowing for autonomy more so in sessions, maybe just to start to adjust the warm up and not tell the athletes it's coming, just to see how they handle it.
I think that's the beauty of what we speak of at Emergence. So like, we set up situations where the athletes can have autonomy and take over and lead and problem solve, right? And that's exactly what's going to make them successful in games, competitions, and they're going to have the confidence and ability to do that within themselves. So that's what it's all about. I think draws me to it and gets me excited.
Well, and it works.
Yeah.
The proof is in the performance. That's the. Yeah, I'm amazed it's such an esoteric little cloistered niche the way it is, because of how effective. Just introducing the aspect of exploring and playing with the concepts and freeing it up, giving a permission just to say, I don't care how you go about doing it, just try it. Get there, go from A to B. I want to see how it shakes out. And I think if I had been doing this years ago when it counted, it's very interesting to me how it feels like you guys are about 30 years ahead of your time. This will be the norm in another couple decades.
I don't disagree with you.
Hope
And
so.
I just wanted to mention real quick, and you said, I wish I'd have known this stuff or something. I wish I'd known this stuff whenever it counted. Keep in mind, obviously, not only you're still doing this, but you have the ability to be able to help educate other coaches that are working with athletes as well. And that's sometimes something that I have to remind myself is, gosh, I would love to be able to work with so-and-so athletes and this athletes and this athlete. But just giving an opportunity for coaches to engage and hear ideas that are different is going to extend and start to cover more space and help more individuals. So
You ever met a boxing coach?
A couple when I was living in the Bay Area.
They're very old school. It's an old boys club.
Most of the ones that I've met, that's exactly how they are. I've only met one that was a bit younger, and he was considered almost an outcast because of that, because he was different. But yet his athletes were very successful. He was in San Francisco area. And so, but he was considered odd because he approached it differently, but yet and his athletes had success, which I thought was interesting.
The funniest thing I was told, and I won't say who said it, but he was like, yeah, there's a lot of fake ass shit out there. It's like, okay, all right.
We had USA Boxing out for camp like last month. They got to watch some of those guys go at it. It was Canada and then Great Britain too. But
God, I would have loved to see that.
I bet.
Oh my God! Now,
Right
I can't imagine the pressure on you guys at performing at that level. That's just astounding to me. It's got to be so fun.
And
you get used to it. You get used to it. Right?
I was going to say, Jared doesn't work with the actual, like the skill of archery itself, but Brenden, I don't know if you know this, but he works with track and field some too, but he works with archery as well. Like, I mean, you want to talk about unique and different sports.
Well, that's something I've always wanted to get in. That is such a unique, bizarre skill set. Like, I think it's beautiful personally.
Yeah, well, Jared's available for the next 3 hours, so you guys.
You want to teach me how to shoot?
Something cool that Coach Lee from.
Like, how do you even train for that? Like,
Something he did cool was he took their little aiming pin out and made them go through their shot process that he teaches without that. So then they didn't have to rely on that little pin, and they were just going through feeling position. Took away that pin, and all of a sudden they're grouping. Well, I mean, he brought them in from 70 meters to 40 meters. And then after like 2 sessions, their groupings, when they put the pins back on, tightened up so much.
I bet they were
just because,
dead on.
Yeah, because they were just focused on their process, going through the process instead of relying on that little pin so much.
We
know?
do that.
So
We do that with shooting. I'm working with a sniper trying to apply these concepts into combative applications.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got, I'm not a fan of guns, but it's a necessary kind of training aspect to it. And he has, he does the same thing. He'll pull the sights off the pistols, or the front sights, or the optics off the rifles, and you have to feel where you're going with it.
Yeah.
And it completely alters the experience. It's the same tool, it's the same setting, but that small change is enough to force you to make these very bizarre adaptations you wouldn't otherwise ever encounter.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of benefits. Yeah,
it'd be like boxing on an ice rink. It's
but it's
goofy.
the same movement, right? It's the same form that he's always talked about, the same technique he's instilling within him, the same breathing pattern, same holding.
Just a modifier.
Or he takes the clicker off, goes through that range of motion. Just little things like that, kind of gives them confidence when they go back to it then,
That's a good coach.
Ideas
Mm-hmm.
as far as
the guy who understands his tools.
As far as target sports and whatnot, there's a lot that can be taken from the conversation you two are having right now by modifying the final target, such as whether it's the peg, whether it is the target that they're shooting at for
human eyeball.
So like taking that away. What about for like pitching or for cricket, or rather than having that catcher's mitt that's right there on a regular basis, there's all the other constraints that are at play at that time. Starting to perturb the system a little bit to challenge or create pressure and anxiety, maybe not presenting that mitt as quickly. These are just ideas that I'm just throwing out there that could be utilized in different sports to not only create more of a unique mover in the fact that they've experienced more, but create levels of pressure and anxiety. That way, if they're throwing to a different catcher that they haven't before and they don't present their mitt till later. I only bring this up because I know a lot of pitchers really creates anxiety for them if they're not throwing to the same catcher on a regular basis. And until you're at the professional level, it's oftentimes not the case. So I just was trying to extend to different sports some of the ideas that you guys are discussing and some that I don't know much about, archery and weaponry.
But the concept of shifting your platform or changing these little circumstances or situations within the event or the training modifiers, they're done because they work, and I don't see why it wouldn't work across the board. I mean, you have to put them in an uncomfortable position. And I think that, and finding out how to do that and finding out how to kind of tease out the skilled behavior regardless of where they are in the environment, because they're what they do when they get to that level, they're going to adapt anyway. But how do you get that? How do you provide a broader range of experience? The broader the base, the taller the structure, right? To spot another platitude. But it's just coming up with these weird little games to kind of tease out these skilled behaviors, because and especially like in martial art, you can give them a whole list of super cool looking techniques. They feel like John Wick for a minute, but as soon as you put any pressure on them, it goes out the window. I would much rather see an authentic adaptation to something that they haven't encountered than a perfect execution of a 100% successful feed. That's not, I want to see the adaptability. I want to, and then they own it when they feel like they've discovered it. They own that behavior. They own it, and then they find out that they can probably put that on anybody. It's
a dangerous, confident thing that you're creating. Hopefully,
Well, and I think also kind of what we're talking about here. Garrett and I were chatting behind the scenes in regards to the idea of repetition without repetition. And obviously, as Garrett mentioned, and obviously quoting Bernstein, this idea of a process of solving a problem time and time again versus repeating the process, or this idea of repetition without repetition versus rote repetition. And I think at a certain level, repetition without repetition in any contextual form, whether it's more generalized or more specific and representative, does begin to insulate one's movement system versus the pressure and anxiety that inevitably is going to be there, right? So I think by creating this problem solver who is then able to be more attuned, who is able to be more intentional under a wider range of affordances, or maybe more open and responsive to a wider range of problems, and then more adaptable in relation to it. I think that's really the way or the path. Of course, I'm biased because of my love for repetition without repetition, but I believe that's the way to, if there is a way to make one immune or make one bulletproof, or at least make the movement system more robust towards handling those constraints, I believe that it comes through the problem solving. And it's obviously maybe goes across sports and across levels of mastery as well, which is what's maybe cool about it. So no matter, Rich opened the conversation today, kind of discussing the idea of these constraints and how these constraints impact all of us, no matter what level of athlete and whatever performer or clientele we have. I think that's why, so if we think about this problem solver paradigm, or this idea, the ideas around it, that's the path. The path is solving a wider variety or more diverse, dynamic, complex problems, and finding the way to exist there more frequently.
Pretty unique conversation today. I know I jumped in a little bit late, but I jumped into a pretty good one for sure. I love it whenever we're discussing a number of different sports and how ideas can be utilized throughout. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that Shawn was obviously just mentioning there, is just the ability to utilize the ideas that form an ecological approach and allow it to be individual and sport specific for them, and allow it to underpin their practice, but yet still allow for ownership and the active self-regulation when they're on the pitch, court, in the octagon, whatever it may be. So, well, I mean, we could keep going a little bit, but I think it's probably a good finishing point for this month. I mean, it was just a unique one to have that we really have touched on a fair amount over the past couple of months, but we really haven't had a conversation that's been centered specifically around it. Probably one we'll revisit in the future. So with that being said, guys, I greatly appreciate everyone being on. As always, continue to engage with us as you do. We greatly appreciate it. It helps us out. It's a lot of fun, and we rely on individuals like you to continue the business and things like that. So thank you all very much for your engagement, your time, and have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you guys for having me. I didn't mean to bogart the time there. I just there's so much great thinking going on behind the scenes here. It's hard to just not take advantage of it, I guess. It's really interesting. It's just
we're happy you do, and greatly appreciate the fact that you're on and willing to engage and ask questions and be transparent and open and share good knowledge and the like, because it's highly beneficial for a lot. And I think something that you bring to the table each time extends into other sports. Really, I mean, honestly, like you'll mention things, I'm like, that's interesting. Like that idea can be used here. And you bring a unique perspective because of your area of expertise and what you do. So we appreciate you being on, no doubt about it.
Oh, it's all stolen. All my best stuff is stolen.
All of us.
Those guys or those gals, because they did a nice job.